Welcome to Starbound. My name is the Voice Ogre. I'll be your narrator today. But before we get started with the video, let me ask to see if you're subscribed real quick. If you're not, it's fine, but it's free, and it will let you know whenever we post new videos. Thank you. Brock Hansen awoke to the gentle hum of his private residence's atmosphere processors. The sound reminded him of ocean waves back on Earth, a comparison that didn't help his lingering homesickness. Neither did the knock at his door, which heralded the start of his morning routine. "Come in," he called out, already knowing what to expect. The door slid open to reveal Marcus, a member of the household staff his father had insisted on providing. The elderly man carried himself with the practiced efficiency of someone who had served wealthy families for decades.
"Good morning, young master,"
Marcus said, moving to the window controls.
"Shall I adjust the privacy settings?"
"Please," Brock replied, sitting up in bed. "And, Marcus, I've told you before, just Brock is fine." The older man's lips twitched in what might have been a smile as he adjusted the window's opacity, letting in the rose-gold light of Orius II's ancient star.
"As you wish, young Master Brock."
Brock couldn't help but chuckle. It was their usual morning dance. His attempts to discourage formality met with Marcus's gentle insistence on maintaining proper service standards. The routine felt especially pointed here on Orius II, where everything about Brock's living situation screamed of his father's influence.
"Shannon has prepared your breakfast,"
Marcus continued, laying out Brock's clothes for the day.
"She's quite proud of mastering several traditional Earth recipes."
"Tell her I appreciate it," Brock said, genuinely meaning it. The staff might be here on Father's orders, but they were good people doing their best to make this gilded cage feel like home. Though she really doesn't need to go through so much trouble.
"Cooking for you is hardly trouble, young master,"
Marcus replied, his tone carrying just a hint of reproach.
"Shannon takes great pride in her work, as do we all."
Brock felt a similar twinge of guilt. He knew his resentment of his father's controlling nature sometimes bled over into his interactions with the staff. They deserve better than that. "You're right," he admitted. "I'm lucky to have you all here." Marcus nodded approvingly as he finished laying out Brock's clothes, all perfectly tailored to Earth's fashion while still meeting Orion academic standards. Another reminder of how his father's influence reached even into the smallest details of his life. The breakfast that awaited him in the dining room was exactly as Marcus had described. A perfect recreation of Earth cuisine using imported ingredients. Shannon had outdone herself again, presenting a spread that would have been at home in any high-end Earth restaurant. "Is everything to your liking?" Shannon asked, hovering nearby with the professional anxiety of a chef awaiting review. "It's amazing," Brock assured her, sampling the perfectly cooked eggs. "Just like home." Shannon beamed with pride, her entire posture relaxing. "I've been studying Earth cooking techniques. The chemistry is fascinating. So many complex reactions just to produce simple flavors." Brock nodded, though he couldn't help wondering what the local food was like. Everything here was imported from Earth at great expense. Another golden chain his father had wrapped around him. Even his meals were carefully controlled, designed to remind him of his father's reach. After breakfast, Marcus escorted them to the private landing pad where his daily transport awaited. The sleek shuttle would carry him on his 20-minute commute to the central spire, burning more fuel in one trip than most students used in a month. As the shuttle lifted off from the private landing pad, Brock pressed his face against the window, watching the western quarter fall away beneath him. The true scale of Orius II's academic megalopolis revealed itself layer by layer as they gained altitude, each new perspective more breathtaking than the last. 100 massive spires pierced the rose-gold morning sky, arranged in perfect concentric rings that sprawled across an entire continent. From this height, Brock could finally appreciate the geometric precision of their placement, each ring carefully calculated to optimize everything from traffic flow to atmospheric circulation. The morning light caught their copper and bronze surfaces, creating a cascade of metallic brilliance that made the whole city seem to glow from within. Between these towering monuments spread an urban landscape that would have made Earth's largest cities look like rural villages by comparison. The space between spires housed countless smaller structures, each one dedicated to supporting the Academy's vast population. Residential complexes for students, faculty, and support staff stretch toward the horizon in every direction. Their architecture, a fascinating blend of function and artistry. Transportation networks wove through the cityscape like golden threads, connecting the spires in an intricate web of elevated tracks and designated flight lanes. Vessels of every size moved through these aerial highways, from personal shuttles like his own to massive cargo ships that kept the Academy supplied with everything from basic necessities to exotic research materials. Their movements followed precise patterns, creating rivers of light in the morning air that seemed to pulse with the city's heartbeat. Agricultural complexes dotted the landscape at regular intervals, their climate-controlled domes glowing with artificial sunlight. These facilities produced a significant portion of the Academy's food supply, their crops carefully selected to meet the dietary needs of hundreds of different species. Atmospheric processors rose between them like mechanical mountains, their upper levels wreathed in artificial clouds as they maintained precise environmental conditions required by the Academy's diverse population. Industrial sectors occupied their own designated zones, their outputs carefully managed to prevent any disruption to academic life. Factories produced everything from student uniforms to scientific equipment, while recycling centers processed the waste of millions into useful resources. Even from this height, Brock could see the shimmering force fields that contained any potentially harmful emissions. The central spire dominated the view, rising higher than its 99 siblings. Its massive form twisted gracefully as it rose, each level slightly offset from the ones below to create a subtle spiral effect that drew the eye unevenly upward. Supported by engineering that bordered on art, it served as both the literal and figurative center of the Academy's vast operation. Streams of data flowed through their own invisible highways between the spires, carried by quantum entanglement relays that created faint distortions in the air, visible only during the dawn and dusk hours when the light hit them just right. These information networks connected every part of the Academy, from the highest research laboratories to the deepest maintenance levels, creating one of the most sophisticated computational grids in known space. Research facilities clustered around each spire's mid-levels, their presence marked by distinct architectural features that hinted at their specialized functions. Some bristled with sensor arrays that studied everything from subatomic particles to distant stars. Others were wrapped in layers of containment fields, their works too sensitive or dangerous to risk exposure to the outside world. Trading districts and entertainment zones occupied their own sectors, their designs more varied and colorful than the academic sections. These areas served as cultural melting pots where students from across the galaxy could relax and socialize, their diversity reflected in the eclectic mix of architectural styles and amenities. Emergency response centers were spaced strategically throughout the city, their distinctive red and gold markings visible even from this height. They stood ready to handle any crisis, from medical emergencies to the occasional laboratory accident. Their presence was a reminder that even in the galaxy's premier academic institution, safety remained a primary concern. As the shuttle banked toward the central spire, Brock noticed how the city's layout seemed to ripple outward from this central point like waves in a pond. Each ring of spires was not just a simple circle, but part of a complex mathematical pattern that optimized everything from resource distribution to student flow. It was the kind of design that could only be fully appreciated from above, where its elegant efficiency becomes apparent. The morning light played across this urban tapestry, creating an ever-changing display of reflections and shadows that emphasized the city's organic nature. Despite its artificial origins, the Academy had grown into something almost alive. A breathing, thinking entity composed of millions of individual lives, all pursuing the advancement of knowledge. Watching the city planet scroll past below, Brock felt that familiar mix of awe and resentment. The Sunspire Academy was humanity's, and therefore his father's, chance to prove themselves worthy of their place in galactic society. It's why he was here, after all. Not because he'd earned it, but because his presence served his father's greater agenda. The shuttle touched down on one of the exclusive landing pads that ringed the upper levels of the central spire. Unlike the utilitarian platforms at lower levels, these pads were works of art in themselves. Their surfaces inlaid with precious metals that formed intricate patterns, celebrating academic achievements throughout galactic history. Force fields maintained a perfect atmospheric bubble around each pad, creating invisible barriers that kept out wind and weather while allowing vessels to pass through unimpeded. Brock stepped out into the artificial sunlight, immediately noticing how every aspect of the environment had been carefully calibrated for comfort. The temperature held steady at what felt like the perfect spring day on Earth, while the gravity matched Earth normal so precisely he might have forgotten he was on an alien world. Even the air had been filtered to remove any trace of Aureus II's native atmosphere, replaced with a carefully balanced mixture that could support hundreds of different species. The main promenade stretched before them, a grand thoroughfare that curved gently around the spire's massive circumference. Its surface was a masterwork of engineering and aesthetics. Plates of polished metal that seemed to flow into one another, their seams forming mathematical equations and scientific formulae that glowed softly with captured starlight. Each step along this path literally walked you through the history of galactic scientific advancement. Floating gardens lined the promenade's outer edge, their anti-gravity platforms holding specimens from 1,000 worlds. The plants were more than mere decoration. Each one had been chosen for its scientific or historical significance. From the first flowering plants discovered on distant worlds to modern hybrids developed in the Academy's own laboratories. Plaques beside each specimen detailed their properties in multiple languages, turning even a casual stroll into an educational experience. Students of various species moved along the promenade with the easy confidence of those accustomed to such grandeur. Orions dominated the crowd, their metallic skin catching the light in complex patterns that spoke of age and status. Their traditional robes, ranging from simple academic garb to elaborate ceremonial dress, created a living tapestry of copper and gold tones that complemented the spire's architecture. Near one of the larger floating gardens, a group of Trapian students gathered around a glowing display, their blue skin luminescent in its light. Their perfectly tailored uniforms and graceful movements marked them as members of the merchant elite, likely here to study trade laws or economic theory. Among them, Brock spotted several wearing the distinctive insignia of the major trading houses. A cluster of Gord students commanded a wide berth from others as they strode past, their pale skin and black spine ridges creating a stark contrast to the promenade's metallic surfaces. Unlike most students who wore standard academic attire, the Gords favored clothing that bordered on armor, a cultural preference the Academy generally tolerated despite its militant implications. Members of the Porthian Combine added their own variety to the mix. Everything from wolf-like beings to avian creatures whose wings had been modified for tool use. Their diversity reflected the Combine's philosophical commitment to unity through difference, each species maintaining its unique traits while working together in harmony. The view beyond the promenade took Brock's breath away. From this height, he could see clear across to the other skies, their peaks piercing the rose-gold clouds like arrows aiming at the heavens. The morning light played across their surfaces in constantly shifting patterns, creating a symphony of reflected glory that almost hurt to look at. Between these magnificent towers, transport vessels moved in precise lanes, their paths forming an ever-changing dance of light and shadow. Holographic displays floated at regular intervals along the promenade, projecting information about ongoing research, academic achievements, and upcoming events. The images shifted and flowed in response to passing students, automatically adjusting their content based on individual fields of study. Some showed complex molecular structures rotating in 3 dimensions, while others displayed star charts or economic forecasts. Transparent sections of flooring revealed laboratories and lecture halls below, their occupants engaged in pursuits that would shape the future of galactic civilization. Through one such window, Brock watched a team of researchers manipulating what appeared to be a contained singularity, its dark mass suspended in a web of energy fields. Through another, he glimpsed students studying xenolinguistics, their bodies connected to devices that helped them produce sounds impossible for their native vocal organs. The promenade's curve prevented anyone from seeing too far ahead or behind, creating an ever-unfolding panorama of academic life. Each new section revealed different aspects of the Academy's character. Here, a quiet study area enclosed in sound-dampening fields. There, a bustling research center where students and faculty collaborated on projects that had pushed the boundaries of known science. Small automated platforms drifted silently through the air, carrying everything from refreshments to emergency medical supplies. They moved with precise efficiency, their paths calculated to avoid disrupting the flow of foot traffic while ensuring that every need was met within moments of being expressed. Several students glanced his way as he passed, and he caught fragments of whispered conversations that confirmed yesterday's demonstration was still fresh in their minds. The news had spread quickly through the Academy's social networks, adding another layer to humanity's growing reputation in galactic society. But he didn't have time to dwell on it. Professor Oubliette's class would be starting soon, and he had a feeling today's session would be considerably calmer than yesterday's impromptu shooting exhibition. The classroom was already half full when Brock arrived, students settling into their usual places while exchanging hushed conversations about yesterday's events. Professor Oubliette stood at his desk, arranging his materials with methodical precision, his golden skin catching the morning light in a way that made his intricate facial patterns seem to dance. "Ah, Mr. Hansen." The professor looked up as Brock entered, his patterns appearing to brighten slightly in what might have been amusement, but which was certainly just a trick of the light on his reflective skin. "I trust you're ready for a more conventional lesson today?" "Yes, Professor," Brock replied, settling into his seat. "Although I'm not sure anything about human history can be called conventional." A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the classroom. The wolf-like student, Fleek, adjusted his glasses as he prepared a fresh datapad, clearly expecting today's lecture to be just as revealing as yesterday's demonstration, if perhaps less explosive. Professor Oubliette activated the room's holographic display, filling the air with a timeline of early human development. The projection cast everything in a soft blue glow that made the metallic skin of the Orion students shimmer, and it caught the edges of Bungir's armored clothing in sharp relief. "Today," the professor began, his pattern shifting into what Brock had learned was his lecture mode, "we will explore humanity's earliest development as a species, focusing on the period before the agricultural revolution. This era is particularly fascinating as it shows the first signs of humanity's remarkable adaptability." The professor manipulated the holographic controls with practiced ease, zooming in on a section of the timeline that showed various early human settlements. The images were remarkably accurate, Brock noticed. Someone had done their research. "Unlike many species who evolved in relatively stable environments," Oubliette continued, his patterns brightening with scholarly enthusiasm, "early humans faced rapidly changing conditions that forced constant adaptation. This led to the development of what we now recognize as defining human traits." Fleek's datapad moved in a blur as he recorded every word. Near the front of the room, one of the Orion students raised a hand, their copper-toned patterns shifting with curiosity. "Professor," they asked, "how did humans survive these environmental changes when other species simply died out?" "An excellent question." Oubliette's patterns danced with approval. "Mr. Hansen, perhaps you could offer some insight from your species' perspective?" Brock considered for a moment, aware of the entire class's attention. After yesterday's revelation about human weapons, they seemed eager to learn about what other surprises his species might hold. "We learned to use tools," he said finally, "and to work together in groups. But mostly we learned to adapt our behavior instead of waiting for evolution to adapt our bodies." Professor Oubliette's patterns brightened considerably. "Precisely! This behavioral flexibility is key to understanding human development. For instance, when early humans encountered new food sources..." The class timer chimed 2 hours later, cutting off what had been an interesting discussion about human dietary habits. Several students made sounds of disappointment, clearly invested in the topic, despite, or perhaps because of, yesterday's excitement. "The eternal enemy of academic discourse, time itself." Oubliette sighed, his patterns dimming slightly. "We'll continue this discussion next session. Please review the materials on the early human social structures for tomorrow." As the class began to pack up, Brock caught fragments of conversations that suggested today's relatively calm session had done little to diminish their fascination with humanity. "Did you hear what he said about behavioral adaptation?"
Instead of waiting for evolution, they...
I wonder what other surprises they have.
Brock's stomach chose that moment to remind him that it was lunchtime. He could return to his private residence, where Shannon would undoubtedly have something amazing prepared. But the thought of another 20-minute commute just to maintain his privileged isolation didn't appeal to him. There has to be somewhere closer, he thought, watching his classmates file out. And maybe it's time I saw how the rest of the academy actually lives. Following the flow of students led Brock to what would be the most impressive dining facility that he had ever seen. The Sunspire Cafe occupied an entire level of the central spire. At this altitude, a space roughly the size of a large shopping center. The artificial sunlight streaming through the crystalline windows caught the metallic surfaces of support pillars and serving stations, creating an atmosphere that managed to be both grandiose and welcoming. The space was arranged like a massive food court, but any comparison to Earth's establishments ended there. Each of the major support pillars had been transformed into specialized cooking and serving stations, their surfaces gleaming with top-of-the-line food preparation technology. The stations were arranged in a precise pattern that Brock realized, after a moment's observation, mimicked the layout of the 100 spires themselves in miniature. "Welcome to Sunspire Cafe," a melodious voice greeted him from a nearby information terminal. The holographic assistant smiled, his form shifting to match his species. A neat trick that probably helped make all students feel welcome. "Would you like guidance to your designated dining section?" "Actually," Brock replied, "I'd like to have a look around first, if that's allowed." "Of course." The assistant's smile widened. "All registered students may browse freely. Please note that each pillar serves cuisine optimized for specific species groups." Brock nodded his thanks and began exploring. The nearest pillar seemed to be dedicated to Orion cuisine, its cooking surfaces kept at temperatures that would have melted standard Earth equipment. The chefs, their intricate facial patterns marking them as highly trained specialists, manipulated molten materials with practiced ease. The light from their work made their metallic skin gleam, creating subtle shifts in how their patterns appeared. Several pillars over, he spotted Bjungir and his fellow Gourds clustered around what appeared to be their preferred station. The pale-skinned giants were consuming what looked like raw meat of some kind, their spine ridges rising and falling with obvious enjoyment. The serving counter was reinforced with what had to be military-grade materials, probably necessary given the Gourd's tendency to express enthusiasm physically.
Can you believe what they're served in?
A voice whispered nearby. Brock turned to see Lariel holding court amongst her admirers at one of the more elegant dining areas. The Trapian social queen reclined in what appeared to be a gravity-adjusted chair, her blue skin practically glowing as she sampled something bioluminescent.
Raw flesh, barely even cleaned. Ugh, so uncivilized.
Even Fleek was present, though the wolf-like student sat alone at a corner table. His datapad projected complex formulae above his meal, which seemed to consist entirely of carefully measured nutrient cubes. His glasses reflected the scrolling equations as he divided his attention between eating and what appeared to be advanced theoretical physics. The variety was staggering. One pillar served dishes that floated in zero-gravity fields, while others maintained pressure chambers for species that preferred to eat in liquid environments. Some stations were sealed behind environmental barriers, providing safe dining for species with completely alien atmospheric requirements. "First time at the cafe?" The question came from one of the Orion students. Not someone from his class, but wearing the distinctive markings of senior academic status and the precise patterns that decorated their golden skin. They gestured at Brock's obvious fascination with the setup. "That obvious, huh?" Brock grinned. "Most new students spend their first visit just watching," they replied. "It can be overwhelming. Each pillar serves between 3 and 5 compatible species, all carefully calibrated to their specific dietary requirements. The central restaurant is reserved for faculty and special events." Brock looked where they pointed. In the center of the vast space stood what was clearly the premier dining establishment, an elegant structure of copper and bronze that rose through multiple levels. Its windows offered spectacular views of both the cafe below and the academy beyond, while its entrance was staffed by impeccably dressed hosts whose facial patterns marked them as service professionals of the highest caliber. "Thanks for the info," Brock said, but his guide had already moved on, joining a group of fellow Orions at their designated pillar. Watching the various species eat was fascinating. Some consumed their meals with elaborate rituals, while others approached it with purely practical efficiency. Every pillar seemed to have its own atmosphere, from the rowdy enthusiasm of the gourds to the refined dignity of the Orion section. Well, Brock thought, might as well see what all the fuss is about. He approached the nearest pillar, trying to decipher the holographic menu that sprang to life as he neared. The images were beautiful, but he couldn't quite tell what any of the dishes actually were. Time to start asking questions. The first pillar Brock approached was clearly designed for silicon-based life forms. The chef, a crystalline being whose internal structures refracted light in mesmerizing patterns, manipulated what appeared to be molten glass with specialized tools. Excuse me, Brock said, catching the chef's attention. I'm new here. Would you mind explaining some of these dishes? The crystalline chef's internal patterns shifted in what might have been surprise.
These items are calibrated for species with silicon-based digestive systems,
they explained, their voice carrying an odd, chiming quality.
I don't know if humans...
I know, Brock interrupted with a smile. But I'm curious. What's that one? He pointed to something that resembled an opal caught in mid-formation.
Crystallized mineral matrix with rare earth elements and organic compounds,
the chef explained, their uncertainty evident in their chiming voice.
The internal structure promotes optimal absorption of organic energy for silicon-based organisms.
Mind if I try a small sample? The chef's crystalline form seemed to freeze entirely.
I suppose? As long as there's no chemical incompatibility, they said finally. Though I can't imagine you'd find it pleasant, unless humans do eat crystal?
Brock accepted the small portion they carefully prepared, examining it with genuine interest. The substance had a strange, smooth texture that reminded him of sea glass. He took a careful bite, considering the unusual sensation.
Interesting,
he said thoughtfully. It's kind of like rock candy, but like with an irony aftertaste. The chef's internal patterns flickered rapidly.
You can eat that?
Sure, Brock shrugged. It's not exactly tasty by human standards, but it's not harmful either. What else do you serve here? Before the still-stunned chef could respond, Brock had already spotted something intriguing at the next pillar. This station seemed to cater to species that required high-energy plasma states for sustenance. The chef here wore protective gear that would have looked at home in a fusion reactor. Is that contained plasma? Brock asked, fascination evident in his voice. The protected chef turned, their surprise hidden behind their protective visor.
Yes, it's a specialized blend for energy-consuming species, but surely...
Oh, I couldn't eat that. Brock laughed. But the containment field is fascinating. It's almost like a reverse of how we cook with heat. He moved on to the next pillar, leaving behind two very confused chefs who immediately began discussing this strange encounter in their native languages. The number of eyes following his progress was slowly increasing, though Brock seemed oblivious to the attention. The third pillar specialized in what appeared to be purely liquid nutrients. The chef here, a Trapian with deep blue skin and striking silver hair, was in the middle of preparing something that swirled with complex bioluminescent patterns.
That looks amazing,
Brock commented, genuinely impressed by the artistry involved.
What is it?
Liquid light,
the chef explained, their voice carrying that musical quality typical of their species.
The patterns are actually complex nutrient chains that...
They paused, finally really looking at their audience.
You're the human student, aren't you?
Word travels fast. Brock grinned. I don't suppose I could try a sample? The Trapian chef glanced uncertainly at their creation and then back at Brock.
As long as it is not toxic to your biology, they said slowly. But it is designed for species that absorb nutrients through photosynthetic processes. It would have no nutritional value for you. Unless humans...
That's fine, Brock assured them. I'm more interested in the experience than the nutrition right now. Looking somewhat bemused, the chef prepared a small sample. The liquid seemed to dance in the container, its patterns shifting in response to nearby movement. Brock examined it carefully before taking a sip.
Oh, wow,
he exclaimed, genuinely delighted.
it tingles. And the flavor changes depending on which pattern you're drinking. That is incredible.
By now, a small crowd had begun to gather at a discreet distance. L'Ariel's followers were whispering amongst themselves, while Fleek had actually looked up from his datapad, ears perked with scientific curiosity.
You can taste the patterns?
The Trapian chef asked, their professional composure slipping slightly. And maybe not the way that you do, Brock admitted, but there is definitely a difference between the bright swirls and the darker ripples. The bright ones are almost, citrusy. He thanked the chef and he moved on, already eyeing the next pillar with interest. Behind him, he left a wake of confused conversations and interested stares. Near the gourd station, Bjorngir's spine ridges had risen to full extension as he watched the humans' unusual dining tour.
Is he sampling from every pillar?
Someone whispered, just loud enough for Brock to hear.
But those are completely different digestive requirements.
Another added.
How is he not getting sick?
Brock approached the fourth pillar. This one apparently specialized in high-pressure environment species. The chef wore what looked to be a deep-sea diving suit, working in a chamber that would have crushed most beings to paste. What's good here? He asked cheerfully, as if this were a perfectly normal lunch tour. The pressure-suited chef stared at him for a long moment before responding.
You're either very brave or very foolish, human, though I'm beginning to wonder if there's a difference.
Word of Brock's unusual dining habits spread to the Sunspire cafe with remarkable speed. By the time he reached the seventh pillar, he had acquired quite an audience, though most tried to maintain a pretense of disinterest. Fleek had abandoned any such pretense entirely, his datapad now dedicated to documenting every sample Brock consumed. The seventh pillar specialized in what appeared to be bacterial cultures, maintained in carefully regulated environmental chambers. The chef, a being composed primarily of transparent membranes, regarded Brock with what might have been concern.
You're the human who's been sampling everything?
They asked, their voice coming through a translator that rendered their chemical signals into sound. That's me, Brock smiled. What's the specialty here?
Bacterial symbiote colonies,
the chef replied.
We culture specific strains for species that require external digestive assistance.
But surely you didn't mean to. Actually, humans have a pretty complex relationship with bacteria, Brock said, examining the various cultures with interest. We've got entire ecosystems living in our digestive tracts. Some of these actually look pretty similar to Earth probiotics. The chef's membranes rippled in what might have been surprise.
You deliberately maintain bacterial colonies in your body.
We couldn't digest most foods without them, Brock explained.
May I?
He gestured to what looked like a particularly active culture. The chef hesitated, transparent tissues fluctuating with uncertainty.
I suppose if you're certain it's safe.
Brock sampled the culture, considering the flavor thoughtfully. Tangy, he commented. Kinda like yogurt, actually. You know, humans make all sorts of foods using bacterial fermentation. This comment caused quite a stir amongst the growing audience. L'Ariel, who had given up pretending not to watch, actually stood up from her gravity-adjusted chair.
You intentionally let bacteria decompose your food?
She asked, her blue skin taking on a slightly paler shade. Sure, Brock said casually. Cheese, yogurt, pickles, certain types of sausage. Lots of Earth foods are produced through controlled bacterial action. The crowd's reaction to this ranged from fascination to horror. Fleek's ears were fully erect now, his datapad recording everything while running what appeared to be chemical analysis protocols. Even Bjorngir had abandoned his meal to watch, his spine ridges rising and falling in what might have been grudging respect.
But how do you avoid contamination?
The membrane chef asked, their tissue structures practically vibrating with professional curiosity.
The risk factors.
Oh, we're pretty good at managing bacteria, Brock said, moving on to examine the next culture. You know, our immune systems evolved alongside them. Actually, trying to maintain too sterile an environment will cause health problems for humans. This statement seemed to catch everyone off guard. The idea of actively benefiting from bacterial exposure was clearly foreign to most of the gathered species. Several students began urgently consulting their datapads, presumably fact-checking this remarkable claim. A sharp chiming sound cut through the growing discussion. One of the Orion students from the central restaurant was approaching, their elaborate facial patterns catching the light as they walked. The crowd parted before them, recognizing the authority their position represented. "Pardon the interruption," they said, their tone strictly professional. "But Chef Toulour has taken notice of your unique approach to dining. He wonders if you might spare a moment to discuss your species' dietary preferences." At the mention of Mikhail Toulour, several nearby students gasped. Even Lydiel looked impressed, her earlier disgust temporarily forgotten in the face of this development. Clearly, an invitation from the head chef of Sunspire Cafe was no small matter. "Sure," Brock said easily, completely missing the significance of the moment. "I was getting kind of hungry anyway. No offense to all these samples, but I really haven't found anything that hits the spot yet." The server's professional composure slipped just slightly at this casual response to what most would consider a great honor. Behind Brock, the crowd erupted into furious whispers as he followed the server toward the central restaurant.
Did he say he's still hungry? After eating from 7 different species food stations,
And he called them samples.
The membrane chef watched him go, their tissues still rippling with agitation.
Fascinating, they muttered, but also somewhat terrifying.
The central restaurant of the Sunspire Cafe was a masterpiece of design. Its copper and bronze surfaces worked into intricate patterns that celebrated culinary arts from across the galaxy. The lighting had been carefully calibrated to complement the natural sheen of Orion's skin, making the staff's metallic surfaces and their permanent facial patterns appear to glow with inner radiance. Mikhail Toulour cut an impressive figure even by Orion students. His golden skin bore elaborate patterns that spoke of his professional status, their precise geometric shapes marking him as a master of his craft. Unlike many Orions who favored elaborate clothing, he wore a simple but immaculately maintained chef's uniform, its clean lines emphasizing the intricate designs that decorated his face and hands. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying that melody common to his species. "I am Mikhail Toulour, head chef of the Sunspire Cafe. I must say, you've caused quite a stir amongst my staff." "Sorry about that," Brock replied, taking in the spectacular view from the restaurant's central platform. "I was just curious about what everyone else eats."
Curious enough to sample dishes designed for silicon-based life forms?
The light caught Mikhail's face patterns as he tilted his head, creating an illusion of movement across the fixed designs.
Most species stick to their designated pillars. Even those with broad dietary tolerances typically prefer familiar nutrients.
"Humans like to try new things," Brock shrugged. "Back on Earth, sampling different cuisines is considered a mark of cultural sophistication." The statement seemed to catch Mikhail's professional interest. The Orion chef gestured to a nearby table, its surface instantly configuring itself for human comfort specifications.
"Please, sit," he said. "I find myself intensely curious about human dietary preferences. Your species is still quite new to the galactic society, and I pride myself on accommodating all palates."
As they sat, Brock noticed their conversation had drawn an audience. Students at nearby tables were trying and largely failing to appear disinterested. Even the staff seemed to be finding excuses to work closer to their position.
"Tell me," Mikhail continued, "what constitutes a typical human meal? I've had limited exposure to Earth cuisine, but the reports are inconsistent."
"That's probably because humans eat pretty much anything that isn't actively toxic to us," Brock explained. "We're what you would call opportunistic omnivores." The light playing across Mikhail's facial patterns created a momentary illusion of surprise.
"Anything? Surely there must be some restrictions."
"Well, yeah," Brock admitted. "We can't eat things that are actually poisonous, and some humans have specific allergies or sensitivities. But in general, if it contains nutrients and we can process it, we can probably eat it." A slight tremor ran through the watching crowd. At nearly every table, Fleek's ears were fully erect as his datapad recorded every word. Even L'Ariel, who had somehow acquired a prime viewing position without seeming to have moved, was leaning forward slightly.
Fascinating, Mohail said, his professional demeanor masking what might have been excitement. And these nutrients come from any source? Animal, plant, mineral?
Pretty much, Brock nodded. We can digest most proteins regardless of their origin. Same thing with carbohydrates and fats. Minerals, well, we don't eat rocks, but we do put frankly disgusting amounts of salt on just about everything. Before we developed tools, our ancestors had to lick rocks for that. And there's also hard candy, which is basically just flavored sugar melted into large solid crystals. We've evolved to handle foods that would make other species sick.
Such as?
The question came not from Mikhail, but from Bjungir, who had apparently abandoned any pretense of disinterest. The gourd's spine ridges were fully extended, his four eyes fixed on Brock with predatory intensity. Well, take capsaicin, Brock said. It's a chemical that causes a burning sensation. Most Earth animals avoid it because it feels like actual fire to eat, but humans, he grinned, we put it in food on purpose. And some people can't get enough of it. This revelation caused such a stir that Mikhail had to raise a hand for quiet. The Orient chef's natural dignity commanded immediate respect, though the light still caught his facial patterns in ways that emphasized his growing fascination.
You deliberately consume substances that cause pain? He asked carefully.
For fun, Brock confirmed cheerfully. We have entire contests built around eating increasingly spicy foods. Some restaurants make customers sign waivers before serving their spiciest dishes. The silence that followed this statement was profound. Even the staff had stopped pretending to work, all attention focused on this remarkable conversation. In his corner, Fleek appeared to be running some kind of probability calculation, his datapad projecting complex equations above its surface.
But why?
The question came from one of the watching students, their voice carrying genuine bewilderment. Brock considered this for a second. I guess because we can? Humans push boundaries just to see what's possible, and food's no exception. Mikhail's fingers traced thoughtful patterns on the table's surface.
I begin to understand why your species has achieved so much in a short time, he said quietly. That this combination of capability and curiosity.
The light caught his facial patterns in a shimmer of professional excitement.
Tell me more about human cuisine. What other surprises does your species have in store?
Well, Brock began, warming to the subject. Humans don't just eat food, we transform it. Take grains, for example. Most species that can digest them just eat it as is, right?
Correct, Mikhail confirmed. Many of our client species consume various grains. The Orient Alliance alone cultivates over 300 varieties suited to different digestive systems.
But humans? Brock grinned. We looked at grains and we thought, hey, what if we ground those into powder, we mixed them with water and other ingredients, so we let specific bacteria and fungi partially digest the mixture, and then applied heat in precise ways to create something entirely new. Though I don't believe bread happened all at once quite like that. Probably just took a while for each step to be discovered. The resulting silence was broken only by the sound of Fleek's frantic note-taking. Even L'Ariel seemed to have forgotten about maintaining her usual poise, her blue skin taking on a fascinated glow.
You let bacteria and fungi digest your food before consuming it, like the Mohesians?
Mikhail asked carefully, dropping the name of the species that transparent chef from earlier belongs to. The light caught his facial patterns as he leaned forward, creating an illusion of intense focus in the fixed designs. That's just the start, Brock explained. The real art is in controlling exactly when to stop the process and how to apply the heat. Too soon or too late, wrong temperature or humidity, any mistake, and you don't get bread.
Bread?
The word rippled through the watching crowd. It's... Brock paused, realizing how strange this would sound to species who had never encountered it. It's this amazing food that's crispy on the outside, soft on the inside, and can be flavored in countless ways. The basic process is pretty simple, but humans have spent thousands of years perfecting different varieties.
You developed this deliberately? Mihail's voice carried a note of professional amazement. Not as a survival necessity.
Oh, it probably started as survival, Brock admitted. But humans have a habit of taking survival techniques and turning them into art. We've got entire cultural traditions built around different types of bread. Some recipes are considered national treasures. The Orient chef's hands moved in practiced patterns as he called up a holographic display.
Show me, he said simply.
Brock spent the next several minutes describing the bread-making process in detail, from grain selection to the final baking. The watching crowd grew larger as he explained concepts like kneading, proofing, and the importance of proper gluten development. The most complex version might be the croissant, he said, growing animated as he described his favorite. You take the basic bread dough, and then you fold it over and over with layers of fat between each fold, and then when it bakes, the fat creates steam pockets, and you end up with this incredibly flaky and this delicate texture, and whew.
Remarkable, Mihail breathed.
The light playing across his facial patterns emphasized the professional appreciation evident in his bearing.
Your species took a survival food and elevated it to a form of cultural expression.
Is not just bread, Brock continued. Humans do this with all sorts of foods. We age cheeses to develop specific flavors, we ferment vegetables to preserve them, and we even intentionally grow specific molds on foods to enhance their taste. The last revelation caused several students to physically recoil. Even Bjorngir's spine ridges bristled slightly, although there was something like respect in his four-eyed gaze.
Your species, the Gord rumbled, treats food as both challenge and art. Like combat, but with taste instead of weapons.
That's actually a pretty good comparison, Brock laughed. We even have competition shows about cooking. Professional chefs battled to create the most impressive dishes. Mihail's professional demeanor cracked slightly at this, the light catching his facial patterns in a way that suggested sudden inspiration.
You compete through food preparation.
All the time, Brock confirmed. Everything from local cook-offs to international championships. Some chefs become as famous as movie stars. The Orient chef was quiet for a moment, the light playing across his facial patterns as he appeared to consider something. Finally, he spoke.
Would you be willing to demonstrate?
Mihail's private kitchen was a marvel of culinary engineering. The equipment designed to prepare food for hundreds of different species lined the walls, their surfaces gleaming with the same careful maintenance that the head chef applied to his own uniform. His facial patterns flickered in the light as he moved through space with practiced grace, gathering supplies based on Brock's instructions.
The grain selection will be critical,
Mihail said, presenting several options.
These varieties are typically consumed by carbon-based herbivorous species. Their chemical composition should be compatible with human digestion.
Brock examined each sample carefully. This one, he said finally, selecting a grain that resembled wheat. The protein content feels about right, though I know only what I can glean from my conversations with my personal chefs and from my own research and practice. Now we need something for the fat layers. Butter would be ideal, but any stable fat that stays solid at room temperature should work. The next hour was a crash course in human baking techniques. Brock talked Mihail through the basics of dough preparation, explaining the importance of proper kneading to develop the gluten structure. The Orient chef's hands moved with incredible precision, his decades of experience with alien cuisines making up for his unfamiliarity with this specific process. The folding is the real trick, Brock explained as they began creating the layers. Each fold doubles the number of layers. Too few, lose the texture. Too many, they start to break down. A small crowd had gathered at the kitchen's observation window. Fleek's datapad whirred continuously as it recorded every detail of the process. Even Lyriel seemed genuinely fascinated, her usual affected boredom forgotten as she watched this piece of human culture unfold.
The fermentation process is beginning,
Mihail observed, his fixed facial patterns catching the light as he examined the dough.
The bacterial and fungal cultures are becoming active.
That's the yeast, Brock nodded. It's eating the carbohydrates in the dough and producing carbon dioxide that creates tiny bubbles. Those bubbles, combined with the fat layers, are what give the croissant their texture. We're gonna have to leave it for a few hours while it rises. A few hours later, Bjorngir watched with all 4 eyes as Brock demonstrated the final shaping technique.
Like combat formations, the Gord observed. Each fold is a tactical decision that affects the final outcome.
The kitchen filled with an unfamiliar but enticing aroma as the croissants baked. Several of the watching students found themselves drawing closer, despite their earlier reservations about human food preparation methods. So the heat is causing the fat layers to create steam, Brock explained, watching through the oven's transparent surface. The steam pushes the layers apart while the proteins set, creating that flaky texture we're looking for. When the timer chimed, Mihail removed the croissants with the same careful precision he applied to all his work. They weren't quite the perfect golden brown of Earth croissants. The alien grain had produced a slightly different color, but the layered structure was immediately apparent. Moment of truth, Brock said, picking up one of the still warm pastries. It crackled perfectly under the fingers, flakes of crust drifting down to the counter. The interior revealed the distinctive honeycomb structure that marked a well-made croissant. He took a bite, closing his eyes to fully appreciate the result. The texture was exactly what he'd hoped for. Crisp exterior giving way to a tender, layered interior. The alien grain gave it a slightly nutty flavor that worked surprisingly well with the rich fat layers. "Is good," he said finally, grinning at Mihail. "It's different from Earth versions, but definitely good." The Orient chef had examined one of the croissants with professional interest, the light playing across his facial patterns.
The technique is remarkable, he said. Such a complex process, and yet the result appears elegantly simple. He paused thoughtfully. Would you be willing to share more human recipes? I find myself fascinated by your species' approach to cuisine.
"Absolutely," Brock replied. Though, fair warning, croissants aren't simple, but they're far from the most complicated. Wait till you hear about what we do with fermented grape juice. To everyone's surprise, several of the watching students asked to sample the croissants. Even more surprisingly, most of them could safely eat them. The basic ingredients were compatible with a wide range of digestive systems.
Remarkable,
Mihail said, watching as even Bjorngir carefully tried a piece.
You've created something that multiple species can enjoy using techniques none of us had considered.
His nod of professional satisfaction flashed in the light and reflected the same golden brown hues as a true croissant.
I believe this calls for an addition to our regular menu.
Really? Brock asked.
Indeed. After all, finding the mind's desire often leads to discovering something entirely new.
Mihail's expression grew thoughtful.
Although, perhaps we should start with simpler bread varieties before attempting these croissants.
The technique requires considerable skill. As Brock left the Sunspire cafe that afternoon, he could not help but smile. He'd come looking for his lunch and somehow ended up introducing an entirely new form of food to galactic society. His father might have forced him to attend the academy, but moments like this made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, something good could come from it. Behind him, he could hear Mihail already planning tomorrow's menu. The head chef's voice carried clearly through the busy cafe.
Next, we shall try something called sourdough.